Hey listeners, thank you so much for listening to HRN. We want to make your experience as a listener even better, and to help us do that, we'd love your input on our audience survey. It'll only take a few minutes, and by completing it, you can enter to win a $250 gift card from Goldbelly. Visit heritageradionetwork.org/survey to take the survey and to help us keep growing and improving. That's heritageradionetwork.org/survey. Thanks for your support.
Jewish food is not grounded, even though it really started in ancient Iraq, and then it came to land of Canaan, and then was in Israel as long as it could be until first there was destruction of one temple by the Persians and then another by the Romans, and then people were dispersed all over. The other quality of what is definition to me of what Jewish food is, it's food that has been in the diaspora and has been influenced by the diaspora. So there's Russian Jewish food and French Jewish food, following the dietary laws, but picking up ingredients that adapt to the food in the country that you're in. And that's pretty much the same all over the world.
Welcome to Kochleffel, a podcast series about the remarkable contribution of Jewish women to the world of food. In almost every aspect of our food system, way out of proportion to our numbers in the world, Jewish women rise professionally and personally in virtually every aspect of food. These women are wonderful. Chefs, academics, editors and writers, corporate strategists, restaurant owners, policy wonks, media figures, and more. And that's what a Kochleffel is. In German, a Kochleffel is simply a soup ladle, but in Yiddish, that wonderful, ironic, juicy language, a Kochleffel is someone who stirs things up, makes things happen, and that's what these women in our midst do. They make good things happen. When we first began to work on Kochleffel, doing a podcast series on Jewish women in food was not controversial. Clearly, in today's moment, everything having to do with Jews or Israel is complex. But as fraught as this time is, we need to come together and celebrate the good that we do, the joyful things we do as individuals and as a world community. In a way, we believe that it is more important than ever to shine a light on remarkable Jewish women in food. We are thrilled that our very first guest on Kochleffel is none other than Joan Nathan. Joan is the doyenne, the epicenter of Jewish cooking. She is a frequent contributor to the New York Times and many other publications. She is the author of 12 books, including Jewish Cooking in America and The New American Cooking, both of which won both the James Beard Award and the IACP Award. And she also wrote King Solomon's Table, which I love, which won an IACP Award and a Gourmand World Cookbook Award. She shares her time between Washington, D.C. and Martha's Vineyard, and we spoke with her as she was on book tour with her new memoir, My Life in Recipes. I have been loving this book. What a life Joan Nathan has had and still has. We are so proud to call her a Kochleffel. I'm a little intimidated only because I have been obsessively reading the new book for the last couple of days and over the week or so since I've had it, and I just love it. I have now sent 3 copies of it to 3 of my nieces who are all in their first apartments around the country. Anyhow, I'm doing my bit to make it be successful. And it's a wonderful book. And all of the questions I'm going to ask you are pretty well answered in the book, but that doesn't mean it. I will forget the fact that I know the answers to some of these things because I've now been reading the book. The first is just basic information. Where did you grow up? What kind of Jewish home was it? Observant, not observant? And what I'm starting to call food secular.
Well, definitely was food secular. I was born in Providence, Rhode Island, and of a father who had just come for 1929. He came from Germany before World War II, and an American mother from New York who he met at one of those camps where men, like Marjorie Morningstar, where you met people. in the 30s, just after she graduated from Barnard. And I lived there till I was 3 years old, and my father sold his business and became vice president of a big chemical company, so we moved to New York. So I lived in Larchmont, New York till I was 13, and then we moved back to Providence, Rhode Island. And that's where my parents lived.
Why did they move back?
Because he bought a business in Rhode Island, and that's why.
And what kind of a household was it? Did you speak German at home?
No, my mother didn't. No, there was no German. Even I would go on Saturdays with my father to, actually in Larchmont, my German cousins would come over from New Rochelle. And I remember they were all refugees. The father would take them, they were twins, little kids, and they would put them in a basket and hold the basket high up and come up to our house. It was always lots of fun when they'd come over. And then but I don't remember when I was first in Providence, but when I came back, every Saturday my father would take me with him to go to my Aunt Liesel's house, who he brought over, and his parents, who he also brought over in the 30s. And they would make German food, and my grandfather would smoke a cigar, and they'd watch the Metropolitan Opera. So, it was my introduction to calf's brains and to German Weber and Schaller and, just all kinds of food like that.
And where was your mother in all of this?
She must have been with my brothers. I think I was the only one who was really interested in food. Certainly my brothers were much thinner than I am, but they were always doing sports and things like that. And my mother was with them. I can understand it. Didn't you have your husband go visit your mother whenever and you could? And my mother didn't speak German, don't forget. In fact, she didn't even want to have German spoken in our house because it was during World War II. A lot of German Jews came to Larchmont. And they started the synagogue that we were one of the founding members of, Larchmont Temple.
And was it a religious home? Was it an observant home?
No. My mother was somebody who both my parents loved going out to eat, taking us all out to eat, trying new recipes. We had a black cook until I was 13. When we moved to Providence, she stayed with us a little bit, and then she went back to New York. And my father had a sort of downfall in business, and so my mother had to learn to cook. And actually, she was pretty good. She had always made recipes of her mother and her mother never cooked. Her mother had a hat store, and she was out all day. They had a cook. But my mother learned from the Settlement Cookbook the German recipes that my father wanted her to know, or from my aunt. Not my grandmother always seemed very old to me, but my father was much younger than his sisters. And he married somebody who was 8 years younger than him, so it made sense. And we had Friday night dinner always, which might have been unusual, but nobody made challah in those days. I don't know if it was the same with you, but they didn't make challah. And there were some Jewish bakeries where we would get the challah from. My mother would always make roast chicken and matzo ball soup. And we'd have a sit-down meal. My guess is my father, he worked when we were in Larchmont, he worked in Long Island City, and he had a factory in Rhode Island. So he would probably come in time for dinner. And then everything was a set dinner. Every night of the week was either lamb chops or, what do you call it? I don't know. We'd have tuna fish casserole one night. We'd have calf's liver one night. It was regimented, and there'd be a vegetable, and there'd be a potato, and you'd have to sit. You were not allowed to wear jeans at the table. You had to be dressed properly, and my mother never would have a ketchup bottle on the table. And it's really permeated my brain because I like to have a nice table.
I don't understand. My mother the same way, and my grandmother the same way. But the idea of containers on the table was a very big deal. You could not have a container on the table. Just no labels on the table.
Exactly.
I don't know why that was so important, but it was.
Well, I don't like it now. Everything is too casual for me right now.
So you were an observant home in that you observed the tradition of a Shabbat dinner every Friday. And
we celebrated the holidays. But my mother's Passover, it was just family. There weren't a lot of people. And my father, it was really hard for him because it was in English. I think my mother basically made a deal with him that she would make some of the dishes that he loved from Germany. She would learn to make them if he would hold a Seder. And he did. Now when I think back on it, I think here he came over, he knew what was happening in Germany. He made a decision in 1923 that Germany was not a place for him. That when Hitler came in for his putsch in Munich in 1923, my father decided to leave. And fortunately, his father had a factory in Milan, so he could go there, which he did. And then he came back, and in 1929, and he realized what was going on in Germany, and he just left. But he came over first class on the Bremen, one of the first sailings of the Bremen. So he came over differently, and they had not that they had their own factory in Rhode Island, they had, I guess, part of a factory because they had water repellent fabric. They had invented, or somebody that worked for my great-grandfather invented this water repellent fabric. So he came with the not the imprint, like the way, what do you call it? How to make the fabric. So he had that little text in his pocket. And so he was really welcomed in Rhode Island. He wasn't treated the way refugees were later. But he knew what was going on, and he must not have been in touch because there aren't a lot of letters that have come down from him, from his family. Maybe they couldn't write them at that time, but I also know that there was a lot of anger because my grandfather got out. My grandfather left. He bought his brothers-in-law out, and because my father insisted, and went to Switzerland, and then my father got him to the States, and my grandmother. And then in the 50s, he went back and learned that his great aunt, who he tried getting out, died in Theresienstadt. So I had always thought that my family, nothing happened to, and I learned that distant relatives of something like 35 were all killed in concentration camps. It's like something you learn much later, and a lot of people are learning these things now. It's pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah, and it certainly has current echoes. I was trying to explain to somebody over the weekend, I grew up with all these stories, and there were always people after the war. When I was born, my parents' home always had different Austrian and German doctors. My father was a doctor and a professor coming and staying with us until they could get their U.S. licenses. And I didn't think anything of that. I didn't really know why they came. And so it was distant for me. But when you're in Israel, every second person you meet has a story. Mm-hmm. So you grew up in a house that had the shadow of European Jewry and the history of Jewish traditions and all. And then you find yourself drawn to go to Israel. How did that come about?
My father was a big Zionist. And so I never wanted to go to Israel. I just didn't. And I was on a plane once with this guy who, we both had led the experiment in international living. It was 1966. And he said to me, the most interesting country in the world, he'd been in the Peace Corps, which I had wanted to be in. He said, the most interesting country in the world is Israel. And I thought, I think I'll go visit Israel. To my father's surprise, I went to see Israel, and I was bowled over by it. It just was exciting. It was young. It was like 20 years old. And I felt like I was in the Wild West. It was fun. The 1967 war had just been. 1969 was the first year I went over there. Could that have been? Yeah. And then 1970, I remember going to Paris first, because I had spent my junior year abroad there, and stayed with this really good friend of mine. And she was about to give birth, but her husband said to me, "What are you going to Israel for? Why do you want to go into Israel?" So I did, and I loved it.
You really did. you went and
I
you
had a great
full-time.
job. Yeah. Yeah. And when I worked for Teddy Kollek, and it was just so interesting. Really interesting.
It's extraordinary that you worked for the mayor of Jerusalem and you weren't a native Hebrew speaker. That's amazing.
Well, yeah. I got the job because the person who had the job, this is life, right? Before me was a woman from South Africa. And she had told the mayor's press secretary that he was ruining a woman's life because he was having an affair with her. And I think they decided they didn't want to have anybody, the secretary and the press attaché, that would do that, that would mix. And so that they figured I didn't know Hebrew very well, so I wasn't going to nose into their business. So that's how so they helped me pass the Hebrew test. No.
You wouldn't be able to really gossip about what they were doing. And how, it seems to me that you were doing everything. Food was a theme in your life, but not a career direction. How did that happen? That you ended up focused on...
Well, I had written my first book when I lived in Israel called The Flavor of Jerusalem. I wrote it with somebody else. And then I came to Boston. I was at the Kennedy School. I got married. My husband was teaching at the New England School of Law and finishing up his doctorate at Yale. And I was able to get a job at the Kennedy School first. And then I wanted to do some writing. I had a year there, mid-career program, which was a great experience. And then I thought, I want to write. I don't know how I got to Tony Spinazzola at the Boston Globe, but I did. He was the editor at that time of the New England magazine, and he was the restaurant critic as well. And I told him I wanted to write about ethnicity in Boston, just about ethnic groups. And he said, why didn't I write about ethnicity in food? Because I had just written a book, and I showed him the book. That's what I did. And it was a wonderful way of starting a career. And I made a lot of mistakes, in which I show in the book, which was so much fun to have collected all these mistakes. So I wrote, and I really loved it. It was a great experience. And then we moved to Washington, and the then food editor, Gail Perrin, wrote to Marion Burroughs and Bill Rice, who were the editors of the Washington Post, and I went in to see them, and they offered me to do a weekly column on just whatever I wanted to do, just ethnicity and food or whatever, or just, I don't know, whatever I found. And I was pregnant at the time with my first child. I was at the ripe old age of 32, and I thought, and I had the echo of my mother, who said, you've been doing so much, just take care of your baby. I was so anxious, and I've had that anxiety a few other times, and I stopped doing what I was going to do. I just thought I couldn't take the pressure every week with a newborn child. So I didn't do it. And I sometimes think maybe I should have, but I didn't. And I've always been a freelancer. And of course, it's something I couldn't have done if I didn't have a partner that was working. But it's been wonderful. Then we moved away, and then I started eventually writing, 1987, I think. I started writing for the New York Times. So it's been a good ride.
And we will be back with more from the incomparable Joan Nathan in just a minute. And we are back with Joan Nathan. And how many books at this point?
12 books. 12 books.
And I think I read that you did 39 episodes of your PBS show as well.
Oh, yeah.
For somebody who turned down a weekly column, it strikes me that you've been extremely busy through it all.
But it hasn't been like a weekly pressure. That's the difference. I see how these food editors especially have to put together a column once a week. It's scary. Maybe if I practiced doing it, it wouldn't be. But it just seems like I'm amazed at what they're doing.
You get into the rhythm. It becomes the rhythm, as someone who did a column for 100 years. But there is pressure. I also did a column every week, and for 14 years, it was super fun. But okay, it's Monday, and the column is due on Thursday. What's the topic? But it's like anything else. When you're working on any kind of a deadline, you get your brain organized around it.
I'm sure. But maybe I didn't want to get my brain organized. I don't know.
I find that hard to believe. I definitely find that hard to believe. It strikes me as I was reading your book that you weren't intentional about choosing food until suddenly you were. That you could have written about politics and people and ethnicity and culture, and then suddenly the seas parted and you were crossing into the food world.
That's what happens in life. I tell younger people that one thing leads to another, and you just take it. And that's what I did. Tony Spinazzola put it in my lap, basically. But I think that he also saw that food was not just what you ate. And that's the way I look at it. And that's why in my book, I didn't start the book with just my parents. I went back to where my grandparents were from and my great-grandparents, just to get a sense of who we all were and where all these recipes came from. Even when I go into a cab, I always want to know where the cab driver is from. And they'll say, oh, I'm from Texas. And I say, no, where are you really from? It just, it tells me more about them.
And people are so interesting. Do you think that your Jewish heritage influenced your choice of career in food?
Probably. First of all, when I was a kid, my father sent me to France. So I learned about Jewish food there because I visited these relatives of mine in Annecy. And I'd go for Friday night dinners to people's houses. And I'd look at it and I think, this food is different, yet the blessings are the same. And it just always fascinated me. And then when I went to Israel, it really fascinated me more than anything. I remember I had a cleaning woman from Morocco. Who ever heard of a Jewish cleaning woman? At least I had never heard of one. Anyway, and she made these delicious dishes like stuffed vegetables with meat and rice. And she did a cake. It was a coconut Cointreau tort. When I was testing it, because I always test my own recipes, this guy was over for dinner and he said, oh my God, this is better than sex. And I thought, wow, this is from a cleaning woman from Morocco. And then I learned about Cuba from Kurdish women and just all kinds of Jewish food, but Jewish food of the country. And for somebody who only knew her mother's matzah balls and the challah that we did, this was like a whole world opened up to me. And it's never closed. It's always been interesting. And now, of course, I'm a little bit more interested in other cuisines. There's enough food for really a lifetime of learning with Jewish food.
What is the difference between Jewish food and food that Jews eat? How would you answer that?
Jewish food technically would have to be kosher food, following the dietary laws. No question about that. That said, you can make challah that's not kosher. You can make all kinds of things. But by and large, most challahs don't use butter, for example, or lard. And I also think that Jewish food is not grounded, even though it really started in ancient Iraq, and then it came to land of Canaan, and then it was in Israel as long as it could be until first there was destruction of one temple by the Persians, and then another by the Romans, and then people were dispersed all over. The other quality of what is definition to me of what Jewish food is, it's food that has been in the diaspora and has been influenced by the diaspora. So there's Russian Jewish food and French Jewish food, but that is following the dietary laws, but picking up ingredients that adapt to the food in the country that you're in. And that's pretty much the same all over the world. And the other thing that I think of as a symbol of Jewish food is this Jewish interest in traveling and learning and picking up new ingredients. And that really started with King Solomon, where he sent out people, the 12 tribes of Israel, each month had to give something to his kingdom. So whether it be wood or whatever, you would go out in these day boats out into the Mediterranean, and you'd go as far as India, for example, and you'd picked up jewels there and stones there and all kinds of things and spices and bring them back. But while you're there, a lot of times they would always be men, they wouldn't be women, and they were young. And they'd meet a woman there, they'd either marry her or not, but they'd want to come back to her. So several would stay, and some others would say they were going to come back. And that's how Jewish communities were started wherever. And so this interest in finding the new, whether it be wine, and Jews have always been in the wine business because of kashrut, whether it be, wine is a great example. The grain business, grocery business, that's what they did throughout history. And they would be merchants transferring these herbs from country to country. A lot of spices. And spices were used as spices, but also therapeutically. So I'm just doing an article on etrog, and I learned that an etrog had, I guess it's QI, the life-giving force. And so it had this reputation for doing this. And so people wanted it. This is before Jews even knew what it was, etrog or citron.
Etrog being a citron.
It's one of the three basic citrus.
They're not very delicious, though. I've had them. They are not very delicious.
They're not. They don't have any flavor. They just, the goodness in them is the scent. And they're not, no. And they're also, most citrus are crossbreeds or hybrids. The only three that are not hybrids are the true citrus, which is etrog, pomelo, and mandarin. All the others are hybrids.
I did not know that. But I think that idea that they were merchants and they traveled and they experienced things and they brought them home tells us a lot about how a culinary palate can widen and morph over time. I recall when I was first married, my first husband is from a Greek Sephardic family, and we moved to Los Angeles. His father had, with his three brothers, they had a Greek diner. Many Greek people did. But we joined the Sephardic temple out there, and I got the Sisterhood cookbook. And it was all kinds of foods that I had grown up with, but absolutely none of them were the way that I had grown up with them. All the flavorings were different. All of the preparations were different. They made matzo balls, but they had tomato in them. And it was incredible to me. It was fascinating that it was familiar and yet not. But they had moved to different places than my family, which came from Eastern Europe. One of the reasons I wanted to do this project was that I started looking at how many people, how many women in particular, have achieved great success, great prominence, great visibility in the food world who are Jewish. Why do you think that is?
I think that Jewish homes are always food-centered because, first of all, Shabbat, just the legacy of Shabbat, and the holidays. So that if you have once a week where you have to be a special meal, it just makes you a lot more food-centered. These are women that are smart. I know so many that are Ruth Reichel, Marion Burroughs, Melissa Clark. It's fun to be in the food world. It really is. You get to know chefs, you get to know all kinds of smart people. I'm very happy to be part of it. But I think that we're more aware of food than a lot of other people. For some reason, we're also aware when there are Jews that are in the business. For example, I was in Paris a few months ago, and a friend of mine and I were walking out of her apartment, and she lives on Rue Saint-Germain and Rue du Bac. And we were going to go for breakfast, and I was going home that day, and she said, Thierry Marx has a new cafe, and a whole chain of cafes, 3 cafes. As we're walking across the street, we bumped into Patricia Wells, who used to write for the New York Times, who came with us for coffee. And she knows everything about France, right? And we went to the cafe, and I knew that Thierry Marx was Jewish. And he was a Polish Jew, and he's one of the most successful chefs in France. And I saw that in this very French bakery, he had the most extraordinary croissant I've ever seen in my life. It was a tubular croissant, and if you open it, it just oozes out with chocolate. It was gorgeous. Anyway, and right next to it was challah and babka. And I thought, how extraordinary. First of all, we're at a time when, even though there's a lot of anti-Semitism, he could do that in France because they're good, right? The point of that was that Patricia Wells had no idea that he was Jewish. And to me, that was such a mark of what he was doing, that I could see, for example, when I went to his 2-star wonderful restaurant near Bordeaux, he made this, it looked like a chocolate babka little roll. And I thought, that's weird to have that in a French restaurant. It wasn't. It was a olive and anchovy like babka roll. He was playing with it. He was playing with food. It is one of the most delicious things that I ever make. I interviewed him, and I could see other hints of his Jewishness in his food. But she never even thought about it. So that's another thing and I'm not sure all the food writers, the Jewish food writers, think the way I do. But I'm zero in on it.
There are a lot of them, outscale for their proportion in the industry and in the population. It's just fascinating. But I think one of the things you said is that they are food-centric in fact that every holiday has food that's associated with it. And
Right.
Those holidays are the way that we mark the passage of weeks and months and years. I think that's very important.
Absolutely.
I also think it's true that if you are Jewish, you see it. I do have what my great friend Barbara Haber calls, she says she has Jewish radar. She always knows when people are Jewish.
Yeah.
Which I think is fun.
Say hello to her for me.
Oh, she's wonderful. She's just wonderful. I love her. I talk to her every week. She's helping on this project, and she loves it.
Oh, good.
She's just such a sunny, cheery personality, always so talented. We have this whole world of Jewish food suddenly becoming everybody's food. All the things that when people would have thought about Jewish food in the mainstream before, they would have thought about delicatessens, and now it's everything. There's this great sort of flourishing of high-end, interesting Jewish food. You are a contributor to making that happen. If there were 1 or 2 recipes which you think of as your bedrock Jewish recipes, what would you pick?
I'd probably pick 3. Brisket, my chicken soup with matzo balls, and challah. That would be, but then there's so many others.
There are so many others, but those were good ones to start with.
Yeah.
I love your challah recipe.
I love my Rosh Hashanah plum cake. Yeah, I like the plum kuchen. I love rugula from Montreal. I don't know. I like bagels. There are a lot. There's also roasted peppers salads and all kinds of Northern African salads and little cashew pesto, all these things that are coming out of Israel right now that are quite wonderful. You're right, everybody's picking up a lot of the Israeli creativity. I don't know how long that's going to last right now, probably not very long. But I always used to say, restaurants now, they trump politics. Israeli restaurants. I remember going to Alon Shaya's restaurant in New Orleans, which is an Israeli restaurant, and these two people that were involved in Mardi Gras were there, and I said, "What are you doing here?" And they said, "Oh, it's new, it's wonderful." And I thought, these are very right-wing people. It's just funny.
I grew up in Boston, and there was this beautiful apartment in the building that my parents owned, and it was always occupied by the Israeli consul. Became the Israeli consul's residence.
Yeah.
And my mother asked one of the consuls, "Why is everybody so interested in everything that's happening in Israel and with Jews?" And he said something which I think constantly rings true, which is, "Jews is news." And when I look at the world today, I have to believe that is true. Jews is news.
Funny.
Thank you so much. I appreciate this very much. I appreciate you making time, and I know this is one of your first days back in the middle of book tour. I love the book.
Oh, good.
And one of the things I love about the book is that there are a lot of recipes in it, but not so many that I'm overwhelmed. I read each section of it and
I think my editor's like a genius in putting this together, because she knew she had, we both wanted the end paper with all those letters in it. And she wanted more recipes than I thought she wanted. And
it's a brilliant
very
book.
Happy.
It's a brilliant book. It's a book you can read, a book you can cook from, and it's beautiful to look at as well. The photos are beautiful.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Kochleffel, Jewish Women in Food, brought to you by The Food Voice. Executive producer and host Louisa Kasdan. Audio director and composer Michael Moss. Recorded at Soundscape Productions in Dedham, Massachusetts. We thank Heritage Radio Network and the combined Jewish philanthropies of Greater Boston for their generous support.